And of course, the point was that the God of Moses is stronger. And in fact, he's the ultimate. But it doesn't discount the fact that there's very real magical stuff and that it might even work. But that's all the more reason not to do it, because it's rebellion against God. You are rebelling against the true God by calling the dark forces. And so there are dark forces out there. There's no manual or dissertation in the ancient world, at least in the Old Testament world, telling you how to work with this stuff.
Well, welcome back, everybody, to the Buried Bible Podcast. I'm Keegan Walls. I am the layman of the show. And I am joining, he's not joining me, I'm joining him. They call him the Martha Stewart of baking up really smart ideas, Dr. Mark Chavalas.
Yeah, thank you.
Were you proud of that? You like that one.
Yes, I'm impressed. It took you all of 3 minutes to think about it. I don't have any garlic cloves, but my granddaughter did give me some confetti in between the long transition between last podcast and this one, which is at least 15 minutes. But anyway, nice confetti for my granddaughter, and I'll keep it near me.
Well, awesome. But yeah, we are back to wrap up and do our final episode on demons. And we mentioned this last episode. We'll mention it again. We do have we're going to be doing a live episode. It's kind of an episode. It's kind of its own little subset. Basically, we'll be doing it here locally in Onalaska, Wisconsin at First Free Church. We're going to be just looking at just the broad view of how does somebody approach the Old Testament in today's world? How can we understand it? How do we look at the Bible through the ancient lens? And Mark will be speaking and teaching. We'll be taking some live Q&A with the people there, and hopefully we can figure out a way to, if you tune in, because we're going to be live streaming it, so it'll be our first ever live episode. We like to do recorded because live is just scary, and who knows what we'll say. So it's our first live event, so feel free to tune in. It's going to be November 21st. 6:30 is when it's going to start, thereabouts, and then we'll live stream it. So, I mean, I guess if you live close, feel free to come on out. If you're not close, I guess you can just watch the live stream. So we'll attach some more details down below. But yeah, without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Mark, and we'll dive into our wrap-up episode on demons.
Yes, now we want to talk about finally getting into the Old Testament. I have one more text from Mesopotamia to provide context, and I think it actually is good to start with this. It's from a series of texts from a new book by Geller called Evil Demons. That sounds pretty cool. It's about a dozen years ago, and he republished some works that R. Campbell Thompson published about 100 plus years ago. But I'm going to look just for a second or two about the diversity of different types of demons, and I think this will segue into the aside statements that the Bible makes about these number two lesser beings, these secondary beings that we can sort of lump together and call them demons, although the term itself as an overall term is never found in the Old Testament. That's for sure. And even the Septuagint will occasionally use the word daimon when it's translating a term. But there doesn't seem to be a hard and fast rule. That's for sure. So here's one of the texts of these are exorcistic texts, and even just labeling some of them will be, I think, of interest to the reader. So, for example, it says incantations. Now, this is the title of the incantation. It's usually found at the end. Incantation, so that the sheriff demon, bailiff demon, epilepsy, the accessory to evil demon, the alu demon, the falling illness, and whatever else should not approach the exorcist. In other words, so these are all demonic things. Some of them seem personal, some of them seem somewhat impersonal, but there must be a demonic host behind epilepsy. What is a sheriff demon? It's hard to translate, obviously. Then it says something really interesting. It says, there's a message to the exorcist. If you're to approach a patient until you cast the spell on yourself, don't approach the patient. So make sure. I suppose it would be like saying, if I'm a doctor and you're sick, I probably should make sure that I'm immunized before, before I visit somebody who's sick. I don't know. I'm guessing. And here's an incantation that you're saying to get rid of a demon. Be adjured by heaven, be adjured by earth. May you, the demon, fly away like a high bird. May you ascend in heaven like smoke. May the demon be tossed on the ground like a storm cloud. In other words, just get out of here. Maybe you're going that way. Maybe you're going this way. And so the incantation will basically give you the rules as to which way you should go. Here's one. May the bailiff demon go out and stand aside. May the good spirit and good genius be present at his head. And so the ones that will help you. And sometimes they're doing this in purifying 7 times 7. And sometimes you're going to like this, the censer and the torch to do it. But we don't know why they're used on particular occasions and why they're not used on other particular occasions. Little of that. So there's just dozens of these incantations. And again, they're called male and female Lilitus, which is a term that is actually mentioned, we're going to find out in the Bible. And so if you didn't, in other words, if you know the Old Testament, if you know the Mesopotamian background to demons, it informs you when you're reading the Bible, the Old Testament in particular, as to when you're looking at some of these names, that these are names of demonic beings, or at least from that world. Whether or not they're always considered to be demonic in the same way in the Old Testament, that's another issue. And I'm going to try to end with a quote from our favorite Levitical guy, Jacob Milgrom. So, for example, you have to bind the evil jaundice demon, the murderous inspector demon. And then it describes what the demons look like. Their lips are black, their face is yellow ochre. And then there's even a toilet demon, by the way. And of course, you have to realize, especially in the ancient Near East, dysentery was just rampant throughout the whole thing. And so, and you'll like this one because you brought the Abkalo up in the last episode. Your incantation of well-being is cast, O Asaluhi, who can rival you, O divine exorcist, who can surpass Marduk, the Abkalo of the gods. The dragon of heaven and earth is the healing incantation of Marduk, the god whose incantations is healing and whose incantation is well-being, who has no rival. And it's kind of like what I briefly talked about with the magical rituals in the Greco-Roman period, is that these are rituals that are probably really expensive, and it's even describing how good this ritual is as opposed to another ritual. It's not nearly as explicit as the ones in the Hellenistic period, but you as the priest or you as the patient are both probably trying to evaluate which one will be best suited for me, in the same way that when I'm prescribing a medicine for you, if I'm a doctor, it's obviously a lot of give and take. You have to give me good information so I can make a decision on what's good for you. And of course, you still have a brain to decide whether or not you think that's the best thing for you. And if not, of course, you can get another witch doctor if you don't like what I'm telling you. So,
no, that's good. So was that the Leviticus?
No, not yet. But so now that was the stuff from the evil demon incantations.
So those are Mesopotamian. Those were all Mesopotamian.
That's Mesopotamian.
Yep.
Now we're finally going to get into the Bible, and the problem is, with almost everything else we talk about, we're going to find anecdotal pieces of information that if you start piecing them all together, you begin to find a pattern unless you don't, because the next scholar will say, no, you didn't find a pattern. You thought you found a pattern. So if you say, all right, let's write a paper on demons in the Old Testament, which people have done, by the way, you would be amazed at how drastically different their conclusions are. I think it's about as different as it is. These are all good scholars who are, well studied, well prepared, etc. But they come up with, very, very different conclusions to things, which might be bothersome. So here's, for example, I'm going to go back to John Walton's article, because remember it was demons in Mesopotamia and Israel. I don't have it, so I'll just go off my notes here. So there are a lot of different creatures / demonic beings in the Old Testament, and I'll just I'm going to give you some of the ones that John labels on page 238 or whatever. Siyum, these are desert creatures. Iyum, jackals. These are specific creatures, and they are clearly demonic type beings in Mesopotamia. So when the writer of the Bible, who's living in this larger ancient Near Eastern environment, when they bring them up, I'm guessing that they have the same meaning to them. So these are wild animals / demons. And yes, they're either or. It doesn't mean that a wild animal isn't a wild animal any longer. It's, I suppose, to be like a werewolf. Sometimes they are, well, now I'm going to express my ignorance, but the point is that sometimes they're a demonic being, sometimes they're just a regular being, etc. And so how do you know the difference when you're being tormented, I suppose?
Is there any time where it's the demon presenting itself as the wild animal, but not the wild animal?
Yeah, but since
kind of like the Nahash or whatever in the
but we don't
not that we know it, but there's the possibility of the seraphim and serpentine beings that it. But there's great debate. Like, is there any debate about that?
Oh, no, not in the Old Testament. There's nothing like that in the Old Testament. In fact, I think this is why you have so much stuff in the intertestamental literature about this, is because the Old Testament is not explicit about it. And so here are people, basically, the intertestamental literature, what they're doing is they're just making all these, they're speculating about all this stuff. And it's very reasoned theological speculation. It's just not authoritative in my mind. So, and I'm going to just say that until I'm blue in the face. Although if I did that, that would be a problem too, I suppose. I'd have to look up a medical text to see what that means. So, but also impersonal phenomena are in Mesopotamia: plague, disaster, pestilence, etc. In Mesopotamia, those are demonic activities, and so they can be personal. They're not always. And so when you read about them in the Bible, they can also take on that same form. In other words, they're from the same cognitive environment, and so they probably have the same meaning to them. It's not a one-to-one correspondence, and so it doesn't mean that every time that it talks about plague or pestilence, it's talking about a demonic host. But I'm going to argue that they are inseparable in the ancient Near Eastern mental economy, of which Israel is a part. And if that sounds uncomfortable, then I'm guessing that fits right into the entirety of what we've been doing with the Old Testament since the beginning, is that this stuff seems intellectually uncomfortable. It's because we're entering into a foreign land right now with the Old Testament. It again, John Walton, it wasn't written to us. It was written for us. We can use it, but it's written in a very different environment, a mental environment that I think what we like to do is sanitize. And I think that's what's been so shocking about what Micaiah did, is he took all that stuff and he basically took all the sanitized stuff, he pulled it out of it, and then he brought it forward to a public and said, wait a minute, why wasn't I ever told this before? Well, there's probably a good reason. It wasn't being hidden from you. It's just that it had been sanitized for so many centuries that it's just been really sort of hard and shocking and maybe intellectually stimulating, but also shocking. And so, so what do you do with this stuff? There are sometimes very particular terms. Groups of demon type beings. When I say demon type, they're lower level spiritual beings. The Shedim, the She'irim, the Lilith, which is usually female but not always. The Azazel, the goat, the goat being or whatever. And then the one that really bothers people, it's the spirit, the Ra'ah spirit, the evil spirit, or the spirit that brings evil, or sometimes it's called a lying spirit, etc. And so, so what do you do with these terms? In the Old Testament, the Shedim, the few times they're brought up, they're the people who actually worship them. That's considered, a terrible thing to do. And of course, they are actually brought out in the documents from Ter Der Allah in Jordan, that are the Balaam texts, that they talk about these Shedim creatures, etc. And so they receive sacrifices or offerings, etc. And the She'irim, they're objects of worship in the Bible. They're not in Mesopotamia, interestingly enough. Foreign gods are sometimes described as demons, although this is mainly post-Hellenistic, etc. So let me just start looking at a couple of texts here and there and see whether or not this will make sense. And again, these texts are isolated. And yes, if I had the time, I would stop at each point and look at context. And maybe we'll do that occasionally in future ones. Isaiah chapter 34, this is, in my NASB, it simply titles this God's Wrath Against the Nations. And if you get down to 14, it says the desert creatures will meet with the wolves. The hairy goat will also cry to its kind. Yes, the night monster will settle there and will find herself a resting place. The night monster is Lilith. It's the Lilitu creature, which is a demonic being in Mesopotamia. And you think it's not in the Bible because it's called a night monster? What's a night monster? It's the stuff in the desert. These are all creatures that are out in the wilderness that are scary beings that accost humans. And that verse could have come right out of Mesopotamian demonology. What does that mean? It's supposed to make us uncomfortable, I think, in the West, is that and I remember, all I can tell you is that maybe I brought this up before, living out along the escarpment in the Euphrates in Syria. We didn't venture out into the desert in the middle of the night. It was scary. And the one time that we ended up doing that, it was like Halloween scary for a little kid. And you had eerie sounds and creatures. And so it's probably not surprising that they personalize these things. But I'm not going to evaluate this on a scientific standpoint. I don't have any credentials to do that. All I can do is to tell you that this is the same conceptual world, as the Bible. So what do you do with something like Azazel in Leviticus 16? Now, you can go to 1 Enoch 16, and it talks about Azazel as a real personal being. But let me get you, in fact, I think this is where I'm going to do my quote for, let's see where he went. So this is Jacob Milgrom. I think I brought him up before. His first commentary volume of his Leviticus commentary. I'm on page 1072. I know if Rico's listening, it's right next to it's on your left side, right behind you, Rico. There, just pick it up. In fact, you probably already memorized the page. He's talking about the Leviticus 16 ritual. And of course, remember, in Leviticus 16, we have two goats. One is dedicated to Yahweh and is offered. The other one is sent out, and it's sent out with the sins, the expiation. So in other words, the animal is sent. Where is it sent? To Azazel. And everyone knows in the ancient Near East what Azazel is. It's a demonic being. Has it been depersonalized? Well, that's up to you. And so this is what Milgram says. And, I suppose if somebody spends, 1,000 years studying Leviticus, he probably should be taken seriously in any events. He says, all right, so these are elimination rites. In other words, what you're doing is you're taking sinful stuff and you're manifesting it upon this goat and sending it out. And we have this, by the way, in Hittite rituals and in Mesopotamian rituals. There's nothing extraordinary about this in terms of the conceptual. He says elimination rites are therefore employed to drive the demons from human habitations and back to the wilderness, which is another way of saying that the demons are driven back to their point of origin, the underworld for existence. And then he quotes an incantation from Mesopotamia. May the spell go out from the patient and vanish into the wilderness. May it meet a strong ghost, and may they roam the desolate places. And so here's a Mesopotamian parallel to what's happening with the goat demon or the goat thing or whatever. It's being sent out. In other words, all of your sinful stuff is now, and anything that's inappropriate is now put upon the goat. It's sent out to to those places out there, which you and I don't go. That's the last place we want to go, is out there. That's where all that bad stuff is. That's why it's sent out to be eliminated out there. And so send it out there, send it back to the netherworld or wherever it goes. And of course, the Bible is using the same type of ritual practice to do that. Does it have a different meaning behind it? Yes, because this is God controlling the whole thing for his own particular purpose, which transcends all this. But he uses the same type of apparatus and hardware to do it. He doesn't change it any more than we change the days of the week just because they're pagan. They're still, we don't think about them as being pagan any longer,
So are they sending the sin demons or the combination of them into the goat to go out to? It's just all of it.
Yes. So, and then he says, thus in Israel, the goat for Azazel, bearing the sins of Israel, though it is bound for the wilderness, is in reality returning evil to its source, the netherworld. And of course, really, if you think about it, as a New Testament believer, who's the God of the dead? That's Satan. Okay, so all of this sinful stuff, it's being sent back to its origin. And of course, you think about all of this. This is why it's so powerful when you look at the theological implications of what Christ does. He's the sin bearer. He's like the goat. He's being sent out. And of course, why do you think they make such a big deal about the fact that Christ was sent with all of the sins of humanity? And where is he sent? He's sent into death. Okay. And then we have this little aside statement, which of course pastors like to avoid, and I kind of understand it, but it's basically, what does Jesus do when he's among the dead? He announces to all of them, hey, guess what? You lost. I'm not staying here. You have me for a few minutes, like 3 days, and I'm going back up and I'm making the declaration, the war is over, you lost. And then he ascends, and of course he's resurrected, which goes against everything that they were expecting to happen. And so that's in other words, we didn't think it was going to happen this way. Anyway, now I don't think that, I think someone like Milgram would think, no, you're going a little too far there with that. That's all that Christian stuff, but that's okay. So we can go a little further with this. Let's talk about some of these other creatures, because again, they're always almost isolated. They're all often in poetic places. They're being alluded to, but they're not ever the main topic. Have I ever said that before? I've said it all the time because we're asking all these questions. And there are so many different types of demons. Sometimes they're called the knowers. What's a knower? We don't know, but they're some sort of evil spiritual being. What is an evil spirit? So let's go to, how about if we go to 1 Samuel 28 for a minute? and just and if you know the story well, and maybe I will. I'm not going to do an exhaustive study on it because, well, I'm just not prepared for. I haven't thought about doing it, but and I'm going to summarize most of it before I get to the spiritual part. And if you want to try to put this in context, where's the other book I wanted to look at? All right, I'll simply mention. Oh, here it is. Excuse me, it's right under Irving Finkel. Great, probably the best Babylonian lecture at the British Museum. This is what you would expect in a Syriologist to be: old with a beard, a white beard down to his toes. And he wrote a book called The First Ghost. It's actually a bestseller, I think, if I'm not mistaken, maybe even on the New York Times list. But he's got a chapter on Israel. And his argument is that, the concept of ghosts in Israel is not unlike the concept of ghosts in Mesopotamia. And of course, even the netherworld is described. If you read the book of Job literally, when it talks about the bars in the netherworld and the fact that they're eating dust, etc., it sounds like it's right out of a Mesopotamian, poetic textbook. So anyway, he has a nice discussion of the problem in 1 Samuel 28. And of course, do I want to separate ghosts and demon? They might technically be different, but they're spiritual beings which can cause me problems. I'm lumping them together with that. So what's the context of 1 Samuel 28? Remember, Saul hasn't been doing very well. He's been misbehaving. The kingdom has been effectively it's been announced to him through Samuel that the kingdom will be taken away from him because of his sins and his lack of repentance. Now the Philistines are coming in on him, and he's pulling out all stops. I got to make sure that I use whatever resources I can use to make sure that I can be successful. Kind of like the Dodgers in their relief pitchers in the playoffs right now. But anyway, now you'll know where this is. They're going to start using their Hall of Fame starting pitcher as a reliever. So what does he do? He consults the Urim and the Thummim in 1 Samuel 28. So God has already told him, the kingdom is lost from you. And he says, well, can I ask you some questions anyway? And I think it's the only time in the Bible where somebody gets a no answer. I don't know how you get a no answer when you roll with the divination dice, but Saul gets a no answer. It's as if God's saying, nope, I'm not even going to give you a yes or no. You don't deserve one. And maybe if you've ever had kids, if they badger you over and over again, sometimes you don't even give them a yes or no. You just say, buddy, you don't even deserve this. And so he gets a no answer. Then he decides, all right, if I'm not going to get an answer from God, I've got to see if I can get an answer from Samuel. But Samuel, of course, is dead. Well, that's not going to stop me from getting him, because since I'm an ancient Near Eastern person, I'm well aware that you can actually consult the dead, necromancy, and the Bible, when it talks about demons, when it talks about magic, when it talks about witchcraft, etc., it doesn't tell you not to do it because it doesn't work. I think they tell you not to do it because it does work, but you are basically now performing and doing things outside of the economy of the true God. You're being a rebel. And so, in fact, this is why witchcraft is considered, like rebellion, because you're going against all the statutes of God and you're performing things, and they actually might work in some respect. And so don't do that. And so he's now pulling out all stops, and now he's showing that he's the ultimate unrepentant person, because if I can't get an answer from God, I'm going to do it in the improper way. And so I'm going to consult a medium. Now, it's traditionally, she's been called the Witch of Endor, but, she's not a witch. She's what is literally called a ghost mistress. In other words, maybe we'd call her a ghost whisperer. In other words, her goal is to call up the dead, and she needs to find out, who is the dead guy that you want. And so I know that it's easy to look at it and say, well, she's probably just a fake. I don't think the Bible takes her as a fake at all. And I don't think the writer is being tongue-in-cheek when it talks about what happens here. And so just think about, let's get to the point where she's actually calling up the dead. You can read the rest of the check in 1 Samuel 28. So Saul, first member Saul comes to the woman and says, I'd like you to, so are you the lady that does such and such? Well, no, it's kind of like, if I'm, you're one of those terrible drug dealers and I'm trying to make a deal, you're not going to tell me anything until I've gained your confidence. I think that's how it works because I've seen a TV show that does that, so
that's your expertise, huh?
Yes, I'm in expertise now. So when the woman is finally convinced that this is on the up and up, verse 11, who shall I bring up for you? Bring up Samuel. And then when the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice, and the woman spoke to Saul, hey, it worked. It's really Saul. I mean, I'm sort of paraphrasing. I mean, it's really Samuel. You got to be Saul. In other words, the only person who would ask for him would be you. And the king said, don't be afraid, but what do you see? And then she sees, I see an Elohim coming out of the earth. That term, of course, just means heavenly being. So she's being very generic at that point. That's verse 13. And verse 14, what's his form, Saul says. She said, oh, he's an old guy. He's coming up and he's wrapped in a robe. And Saul knew it was Samuel. And he bowed with his face to the ground and did homage. Okay, so then Samuel said, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? I thought that was really one of the most interesting statements. Let's just say this is actually happening and that they're successful in their necromancy. And somebody calls you back up. Is that the first question you're going to ask? Like, hey, what do you want? It's like, like where, I don't know. Maybe I've watched too many shows, but we're sort of conditioned by that. But, it's like, it's almost comical, except it's pseudo comedy. It's not really comical at all. And Saul answered, oh, well, I've got this earthly problem. I got the Philistines are going to attack me, etc. And I don't know what to do. God doesn't answer me through prophets or dreams and he doesn't say the Urim or the Thummim, but, by nothing. And Samuel said, verse 16, what are you asking me for since God has already departed from you? And then think about it. Here's a dead spirit, which Samuel is, now prophesying to Saul with stuff that he already knows. And then you think about it, then the area is reversed here. The woman is now sees that Saul's terrified and she tries to comfort him. And then you don't ever hear about Samuel again. Of course, he's done his duty. If this is a play, he's out of the scene. And so he's no longer there. But how do you, from a standpoint of theology, the theology of heavenly beings, how on earth do you evaluate this? Because this is one of the few places where you actually have a narrative about a heavenly being, okay, and about a necromancer. It's, I think, maybe the only actual example of it in the Bible, and it's so eerie and it's so uncomfortable. And maybe I'm going to just sort of leave it there and say, all right, just in case you're wondering, this is the intellectual milieu of the Old Testament. And I'm in terms of my intellect, I think 1 Kings 22 is even more difficult to try to digest because it involves God. So here we are in 1 Kings 22, and you probably know this story also. The principle is the same. Ahab, though he seems to acknowledge the God of Israel, he's always doing things to stretch things and do them improperly. And so Ahab has remember he and Jehoshaphat, the two kings, are ganging up together to fight Aram. This is sort of like an unholy alliance, these three. And so it's like a weird love-hate triangle. Sometimes it's you and I against them, and sometimes it's them and you against me, and, et cetera. And so now, and so Jehoshaphat, who's a pretty good king, I would say he probably gets a B when you look at the kings of Judah. He's certainly a good Yahweh worshiper. He's clearly allied with Ahab, and I would say he's probably sort of subordinate to Ahab in some respects. Well, they're getting together, and if you remember the story in 1 Kings 22, Jehoshaphat, Ahab's talking about, obviously if you go out to battle, you've got to make sure that God or gods are on your side. So you're consulting your prophets and your divination priests and whoever else there are to make sure. This is why, for example, when Deborah prophesies to Barak about their victory, the Barak basically says to Deborah, okay, that's nice that you did that. I need a second opinion, because I always get a second opinion when somebody tells me to go out to battle. And Deborah says, well, it's too bad that you're asking for one. It shows a lack of faith, and so you're not even going to get the glory. You're not going to get the win. When we get the W for the victory, it's going to go to your relief pitcher, JL. Sorry for the baseball analogy. Actually, I'm not. It's all I can think about right now. But so in 1 Kings 22, he's asking for all these things, and of course Jehoshaphat says, aren't there any Yahweh priests around that you can consult? I mean, you've been consulting all these other guys and Baal priests, but I am a Yahweh worshiper. I do come from the south. I mean, couldn't you at least do that? And if you remember the story, Ahab says, yeah, there's this one guy, Micaiah, but I don't like him because he never tells me what I want to hear. Like, well, that sounds like a 3-year-old talking, like just sharing. He doesn't realize it's socially unacceptable to say that. Like, no, I don't like mommy right now because she doesn't let me do what I want. All right, sorry. So remember when Micah comes in, the first thing he does is he tells Ahab exactly what he wants to hear, and Ahab gets furious. Like, okay, fine. I get what you're doing. You're being ironic and sarcastic. Now tell us. And so now let's talk about verse 17. Here's Micaiah says, I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains like sheep, which they have no shepherd. And the Lord said, these have no master. Let each of them return to his house. And then Micaiah says, verse 19, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne. And of course, what do you do when you see God on his throne? That means he's ruling. He's the ruler. And all the hosts of heaven standing by him, on his right and on his left. Well, you know who they are. That's got to be his divine council, wouldn't you think? I mean, it's the whole host, and they're all there. And then the uncomfortable part. The Lord said, who will entice Ahab to go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said this, and another said that. Then verse 21, then a spirit, a ruah, just a spirit. That's just a generic statement. What type of being this is this? It's one of the heavenly creatures. It would be like saying an earth creature. In other words, which one is it? A monkey? Is it an ape? Is it a human? Etc. It's just telling you one of the heavenly creatures right now came up and said, "I'll do it." I'm paraphrasing. 22. How? And of course, God is all-knowing, but again, my argument is that the transcendent God of Israel allows the heavenly council to participate in the affairs of the universe, within reason, I suppose, in the same way that he allows us to participate in the affairs of the universe. And how do we do it? By prayer. And so if prayer didn't make a difference with God, why on earth are we doing it? That's why God, when it says God repented, and I'm going to do a podcast on this, it's actually a word that means God felt compassion for something. And so I prayed, oh, please, God, help me. And God said, oh, I think I'll help him. And so that's here. It's a little weird here, but the Spirit's saying, I want to please you. I'll entice him. Well, how are you going to do it? I'll go out and I'll be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And then he said, okay, you are about to entice him and also prevail. Go and do so. So, therefore, verse 23, behold, the Lord has put a deceiving spirit in the mouth of all your prophets, and the Lord has proclaimed disaster against you. And of course, remember what happens in the story. Ahab goes out, he tries to put on, different armor so it won't look like he's the king of Israel. And of course, it doesn't work. A stray arrow gets him. Same thing happens to a good king later on, Josiah. But the point is, what do you do with this creature? Now think about it. What is this creature? Is the creature evil? By the way, evil, I think in the Old Testament, is more of a thing that is called misfortune rather than something that is inherently sinful. It can be, but misfortune is misfortune. It's not intrinsically bad. And so this is a spirit of misfortune, or here in this particular case of lying. You might think, well, no, it's got to be a bad thing. It's a lying spirit. It lies. Lying is never right. And I suppose maybe as a teaser, you really can't say that. It sounds sort of weird, but there are some times when lying is of benefit, especially in wartime. And this is wartime. And think about it. Who lies and gets blessed by God? Rahab, the midwives. So why are they? Because they're doing it to protect the interests of Yahweh. And so they're on Yahweh's side, and it's wartime. And so if it's wartime and somebody wants me to lie, do I have Jews in my house? My answer is I'm going to lie to protect them, because I'm not going to say I cannot lie. I can never lie. That's not the point. In the Bible, when it talks about not lying, it's lying under oath, which will basically protect your sinful interests. That's what it means. And this is something very different. Whew. And, of course, remember, is it 1 Samuel 16? I think so, where Saul has an evil spirit bothering him. That's a spirit of misfortune, by the way. It doesn't mean that the spirit is evil, who bothers him and who comes and plays the harp to help him. It's the future king of Israel, David, who soothes the savage beast, Saul. These are real beings, the way they're described. You can argue that if you like, you can argue that they're simply, descriptive, and they're not described as enemies of God. So what do you do with them? And then, of course, what do you do with the accuser that comes and floats around Job, who is probably in the same category? Now, Micaiah, I think, makes a good argument. Maybe the jury's still out that's the accuser there is not necessarily the Satan of the New Testament. It's and what do you expect an accuser to do? He accuses, and God doesn't seem to flinch. It's like, how dare you, say that, do this or do that, So, are these divine council members? Sort of makes me uncomfortable, because it doesn't seem to fit my theological box. And so, what the Bible's telling me? Maybe you should switch your box. There's something going on. So none of these beings seem to be at least explicitly described as enemies of God.
Let's stop there for a second.
Yeah.
Just because that last one messes with me a bit, because it seems as though God, now again, then the argument I suppose could be that when God's doing it in and of himself, he can't do evil. And so when it's for his purpose, it's not bad, but he seems to be the one giving the green light and starting this, go deceive them.
Yeah. So what do you do with that? I mean, to me, that's a really uncomfortable place in our theology, but it's there. So this is the whole counsel of God. And so we, instead of trying to sanitize this, I need to incorporate this into my theology. Now, am I able to do this in a way that's not imperfect? No, this is uncomfortable, but in some ways it's almost comforting because, the Bible says God's the author of good and evil. And of course, what that means is that ultimately everything stems from him. And so that means he's under my care. So when harm comes to me, I know that if you're a 5-point Calvinist, you might want to argue that God is doing that for your own good, for this or that. And my answer is no. God, what does it mean? I'm not a theologian, so I'm going to say permissive will or whatever, but God will take that harmful thing and use it for his own good. In this particular case, he's doing it to make sure somebody who has evil designs is thwarted in his designs. And so the spirit isn't evil. The spirit is doing, and I shouldn't even use the word evil. The spirit is doing things that are harmful. But it's not talking about the nature of the spirit, if that makes sense. I don't know. So,
but then again, doing it for his own glory and for the will of what is good and God's kingdom.
You think about it. Here we are living in a hopelessly sinful world, and God. And again, I'm to me, the way I'm saying this is would be comparable to maybe what a 4-year-old would be thinking about it. But it's like, here's God trying to weave in and out of a sinful world to make sure there's a way for sinful creatures to be pulled out of it in some way. And in order to do that, there's got to be a lot of difficult and painful stuff happening. And God has to do things behind the scenes that have to be done. You have to realize this is warfare. If you think of this as spiritual warfare, and you think of, let's say, since I've never been in the military, but I'm trying to imagine what the Allies had to have done to defeat Nazi Germany. They had to do things that were really, really difficult and harmful and terrible things to defeat evil. And if you think of God, maybe in an analogous way, doing the same type of thing, that he's doing things that for the human being, we're sort of to me, when I look at this passage, it's as if God opened up a little tiny a pinprick of a window just for a second to let you look in to see what was really going on out there. And it's as if, wow, I got my hair singed. Close it up. I'd rather not know what's going on. Sorry about the clap.
No,
so,
you're good.
But it's almost like you couldn't bear it. If I give you any more information, you would be so traumatized for the rest of your existence. Just take this as a warning that there's a lot of stuff going on out there. And I look at it. I know that the spirit of our age is to be obsessed with paranormal stuff and all the activity. And I'm gonna take the guess that that's probably really real, and it's absolutely terrifying. And we have no idea what we're dealing with. And once in a while, God opens up the veil and lets us see something, and it's like, wow. But to me, I'm comforted by a passage like that because it means that whatever evil type stuff, misfortune is happening, God ultimately is in control of all of it. He was from the very first verse of the Bible. He's in control. It explains how evil got to the earth. It doesn't even explain how evil started in heaven, because we couldn't even bear that part. There's already an evil person in the guise of the Nahash, the snake thing, and we're not privy to that information. Although, of course, intertestamental writers want to tell us about that too. Understandable. And so you look at a passage like that, and it's like, okay,
That makes sense though
Yeah.
to me, because my mind wraps it up. Again, I think the lying is a good, easy analogy for me to understand, because again, we, even as Christians, if we're going to right, like, don't be like the Pharisees, and if you're going to be legalistic, it's like sin in and of itself, or the rules as the world looks at it when it comes to God. Well, God just gives you a bunch of do's and don'ts, and it's like you're missing the point in the heart behind it.
Yeah.
And well, God says, like you said, well, God says don't lie, so then you can't lie. And it's like, no, but it's the root of lying.
Yes.
And lying is an outward expression, or like a vehicle that can be used, like, in a weird sense, like lying to protect. World War II is a great example.
Yeah.
I'm harboring Jews, or even in our, I'm harboring slaves.
Yes.
It is a good vehicle for their betterment if I lie.
Yes. Right. And you're also showing your loyalty to God.
Because it's not lying in and of itself, just like a lot of things. Well, you just can't do that. Well, you can't. Well, lust is just, well, just stop lusting, and it's like, no, but you're getting at the root and the heart of that. My affection and intimacy is supposed to be with God alone, and so for me, I guess that's how I reconcile those things in my mind, and it makes sense.
And you think about it. I mean, even God, He deceives the devil. He deceives the devil at his own game by allowing Christ to come and be a sacrificial lamb. And the devil bought right into it. In other words, he went right with the deception all the way to the end, and God didn't even tell his heavenly host about it. It seems like, if you read Paul in 1 Corinthians 1. So, and so the whole point behind sin is rebellion. It's disloyalty. And so you're right. It's easy to just start looking at all the rules. Well, I'm loyal because I added all the rules. No, you're loyal if you're loyal. You're loyal because I'm in this camp. That's right. Now that you're in my camp, now you're going to do things that are loyal to me. Okay.
Which would be, who creates the description is the object of description. Who is love? God.
Yes.
And God is love, so God defines love. God is truth. God defines truth. Which, I guess, to add a little thing that's been helpful in my life that maybe fits for the podcast doesn't, is when I approach the Bible, again, it's not, I don't know necessarily what's good. I'm broken and imperfect. And so when it came to, even before studying all this stuff with you, was by the grace of God to have the faith to when I first got saved and read my Bible, it's like, that doesn't really make sense to me. But it was always this heart of, but if, like, people have a problem with certain things the Bible says, but when you come to that end or a difficult part, it's faith and love of God where you come to the end of that passage and you just say, I don't understand it. But if God says it's good, it's good. Because what he says is good is good.
Yeah.
And it's like a simple fact, but when we can let that, and I guess it's applicable here in a sense, like when we can read the Bible and understand and know God in that sense of, even if I don't understand, like if you say it's good, then it's good and I'm good with it, regardless of what wrestle and how I'm going to have to, however many months or years I'm going to have to wrestle with it and pray about it and try to reconcile it in my own mind. If you say it's good, it's good.
And that's faith. Faith is acting in loyalty. In other words, I believe it to be true, so now I'm going to act loyal by actually following the rules, even if I don't understand them. In fact, I'm not going to understand them. Now, I think maybe I'll finish up with Psalm 91. And you're thinking, well, why would I finish up with Psalm 91? This guy, Vrugdenhill, I'm sure I'm saying his name terribly wrong. Dane, Garrett Vrugdenhill. Is he Dane or Dutch? I'm really Dutch. He wrote a whole book just on Psalm 91 and the demonic menace. And he gives a whole chapter on demons in the ancient Near East, demons in Israel. In other words, he sets the whole stage for the book. This came out, I think, in 2020, by the way. And I don't have my own copy. I actually got it through the University of Wisconsin-Madison library, where I'm borrowing it for a period of time. And, when you look at Israel, you find, even the excavations, you find amulet after amulet after amulet. You know what amulets are for? They're to ward off demons. They're everywhere. We find them in Mesopotamia, but we also find them in Israel. Why? Because those poor people they're kind of like Saul. They're going to pull out all the stops to do what they think they need to do, even if they know it's not, considered to be, correct. So, if I just start reading this psalm, maybe it'll give you a guide as to try to look at other things in the Bible. Psalm 91 is, it's described here, security of the one who trusts in the Lord. So, he who dwells in the shelter of the Most High, that's the El Elyon, that's the high, will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. So it's the same name for God. That's Shaddai, so it's the same name, but of course it's beautiful poetry. It's being sung. I'm not going to sing it because I don't know the tune.
That was my next question.
Otherwise, I would have Keegan sing it, because he actually has. He does occasionally sing in our church. So not.
But just like the podcast, that's why I wear a hat, so then nobody really knows who's up there.
He hasn't done solos yet, but I'm with all the info.
That was so 6 years ago.
Yeah. Oh, really? I missed it.
On purpose, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Aaron said, do not come.
Yeah. Okay. So I will say to the Lord, there's the word for Yahweh, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. Verse 3, for it is he who delivers you from the snare of the trapper. Mesopotamia, that's a demonic being. And from the deadly pestilence, that's another being. And of course, pestilence, I didn't look it up, but I'm going to guess that's the same word for the angel of the pestilence in Exodus. So it's, and think about that creature there. What's the angel of death? You think about it. God is so powerful that he can manipulate everything in the universe. He can even, if you think about it, in Isaiah chapter 10, God is talking to Assyria. It says, woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger. I'm going to use Assyria to go down and attack my own people, and then I'm going to punish them for doing it. And so God actually moves nations to do harmful things to other nations as judgment. And to me, the comfort of that is, oh, now I get it. The God of the universe is actually in control of what's going on. I can be comforted even when I see terrible, harmful things, and it looks like complete chaos. From my neighborhood, it looks completely chaotic. God's got it under control. Oh my goodness, thank goodness. At least I can have comfort in that, even if everything around me is, a disaster. And so the principle is the same here with the angel of death. Is the angel of death good or bad? My answer is it doesn't matter. It's doing harmful things. And God is manipulating and controlling it. Why? Because he's the king of the universe. And so if you're a harmful creature, you do whatever you want, but I'm going to make sure that whatever you do, it's ultimately going to be according to the purpose that I have. If we didn't think about it, if we didn't believe that, what's the use of believing in Christianity? If you didn't think that God ultimately had a purpose in all of this, like Romans 8:28, all things come together for good, which of course you shouldn't say to someone who's grieving, but it's like, okay, is there a purpose in this? Was there a purpose in Charlie Kirk's, horrible death? Yes. Do I know exactly what it is? No, but that's not even the point. The point is God's got it under control. And sometimes he allows us to have a little window of seeing stuff like that. All right, I'm getting theological again. Okay, now, verse 4, he will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you may seek refuge, and his faithfulness is a shield and a bulwark. So that's the positive part. In other words, he'll protect you from those bad things, and he's got his stuff that he'll, and he's like a bird that protecting his things. 5, you will not be afraid of the terror by night. That's the night creature that's scary. Or of the arrow that flies by day. And of course that can be a thing, but there are also in Mesopotamia day demons. It's not just night demons. they're scarier because you can't see well, but there are day demons too. And in Israel, they're known. Verse 6, of the pestilence that stalks in darkness. I know you're thinking, oh, that's just poetic stuff. Well, it's poetic stuff and it's concrete stuff for an Israelite. Their conceptual world is different than ours. This is real. Or of the destruction that lays waste at noon. So it doesn't matter day or night, whatever scary stuff is involving you, God's going to protect you. That's what the famous verse, 1,000 may fall at your side and 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not approach you. And of course, that's poetic and from the standpoint of no matter what you see around you, make sure God's got your back. Let's go down to 10. No evil will befall you, nor will any plague come near your tent. And the term there for plague, again, in Mesopotamia, that's a demonic host. And so you can see it the same way here. And then 11, the one that Satan quotes in the wilderness, for he will give his angels charge concerning you. Now, I didn't look it up, but I'm going to guess the term there for angels is could be Elohim. I should have looked it up. But, these are his heavenly creatures that are under his control to guard you in all your ways. Now, they will bear you up in their hands that you do not strike your foot against the stone. You will tread upon the lion and the cobra, the young lion and the serpent you will trample down. Now, I'm looking at these in a double entendre. Those are real animal creatures that are scary that I don't want to be around, but they're also names for demonic beings that are out in the wilderness. And so if they come out, if you think about it, you'll watch a movie about people, in India somewhere, all of a sudden a lion comes into the village or a wild elephant, etc. And so they always have that fear, at least in the movie. Well, Israel was no different. Wild animals or other creatures or creatures of the night are always there. And so when the guy's praying to God, he's praying, these aren't just platitudes. Like it could happen, in the next minute. Because he has loved me, therefore I will deliver him. Now, God speaking, the problem with the Psalms is that it never lets you know when the first person becomes third person. I will set him securely on high because he has known my name. In other words, he's in my environment. He knows my character. And then it finishes off with God talking about this. So, and there's and maybe just to sort of summarize before your more comments, the Rabisu demon in Mesopotamia is probably the same root that is used. I mentioned this before, but I'll just sort of rehash it in Genesis 4:7 when it says that sin is crouching at the door. Sin is a croucher at the door, and the word there is the same word that is used for a demonic being in the Near East. In fact, Rabitsu, formerly an Akkadian participle from the word rabatsu, to crouch or to lie in wait. So it's the lion waiter, I suppose you could say. And so it's a real demon. And so I think that even if it's been demythologized in Genesis 4, which I'm not convinced is true, the reader is going to look at that and know exactly what's being talked about. And then, of course, another one is the Rephaim, who, the Rephaim looks as if it's a homonym for a couple things, because you've got the spirits of the dead, you've got the giants, and maybe they're all the same creatures, but the Rephaim are often talked about as one of these malevolent creatures that are bothering them. But again, there's no dictionary explaining any of these things for us. And so if I leave you hanging after all this, it's because that's where I am right now. We have all of this information, and you can, like I said, start with something like Psalm 91, which is probably the most explicit psalm, but they're all over the place especially in poetic texts where it talks about these creatures, because that's where people's guts are. That's, by the way, that's the seat of emotions. It's your lower extremities, by the way, which is sort of funny for a Westerner. What do you? Anyway, I won't even go there. But the point is,
still use it. We say trust your gut.
Yeah, but here it's actually sometimes even lower.
Yeah,
but you move me, I suppose it would be a way to say it. So I'm going to get in big trouble for that. So, but I don't even know where I was going with this. But the point is, these Psalms are one reason why I love the Psalms is because it's at the core of your very being. You can pray this and say, yeah, that's exactly how I feel. It starts off really high. Oh God, I'm so glad. Oh God, I'm so low. I hate life. I want to end it. This is terrible. Oh, but I thought about you. And so it gave me some hope. Oh, but I feel terrible again. And so you're thinking this guy's schizophrenic. No, he's giving you all the composite feelings that one might have maybe over a day. And haven't you ever had that feeling? You wake up, oh, this is the worst day of my life. Oh, it didn't work out that way. This is the best day of my life. And of course, and then, oh, I'm sorry, God, I wasn't thinking about you. That's why I freaked out when such and such occurred. I'm guessing I'm not the only one who's ever had this issue. So if this leaves it unresolved, all I can tell you, I hope this sort of opens up a window for you to look at the Old Testament and as a place where it was intimately aware of the spiritual world around it, benevolent and malevolent, and the world around them did it without the benefit of having the transcendent God of the universe protecting them. And so they had to sort of blindly go their own way, trying hard to basically find meaning in their life and to find a way to stop the bad things from happening to them. Because, of course, for every one of us who are breathing, at some point in our life, things are going to happen that are evil. When I say evil, I mean that there are things that go against our preference. When I say preference, I mean that from the, at our ultimate core, I don't want this harm to happen to my loved one or to me or to whoever, but it happened anyway. And the God of Israel is there to protect us. And so he doesn't want you to rely on these other things because you're not relying on him.
Mm. Well done.
Oh,
well, let's jump into some questions. And
all right.
Some again, as the wrap up, some of these maybe I asked on other ones, but either way, it's good. It'll be a good reminder or a good wrestle to maybe dive in a little bit deeper on those. So my first question would be, mainly using that psalm where it talks about like the trapper, when it references what is easily understood demons from Mesopotamia, is that giving credence and is that speaking truth to those are real? Is that God meeting them where they're at, and so they think it's real, so it's God giving them comfort? Or is it more like the beginning of Genesis, where it's theological messaging, where they think that, it's not the Bible saying demons aren't real, but is it the Bible giving theological messaging almost in a way of, okay, well, you think this thing is here, well, God's above that, greater, better, stronger.
I don't think it's an either or. I think that we think either or because of our scientific revolution background.
I knew you'd say that.
Yeah, good. Because I don't know what else. And so, and again, I'm sort of now venturing into, hardcore theology. And so, I will definitely be open to constructive criticism here. But first of all, if you ask an Israelite, is this stuff real? They wouldn't even hesitate for a second to tell you this stuff is real. They wouldn't hesitate. So if they're, and does that mean that their theology is absolutely correct? Not necessarily. But if you ask the person who's writing this, who's authoritative and inspired by God, I think they think the same. that this stuff is real. This is why it's dangerous. You think about magic. In Exodus, when Moses comes and does what I would call his imitative magic to Pharaoh, with his staff and all that, what do the Egyptian priests, the Egyptian magicians do? They can do something, but they can't do it at the same level that Moses does. It doesn't say, oh yeah, they tried to do it, they couldn't do anything. No, they did their stuff, but Moses' so-called magic was stronger. And of course, the point was that the God of Moses is stronger. And in fact, he's the ultimate. But it doesn't discount the fact that there's very real magical stuff and that it might even work if you do it right. But that's all the more reason not to do it, because it's rebellion against God. You are rebelling against the true God by calling the dark forces. And so there are dark forces out there. There's no manual or dissertation in the ancient world, at least in the Old Testament world, telling you how to work with this stuff. But it's considered very real. And if you read, that's why if you translate Ephesians 1-3, and if you read it with those eyes, the principalities and the powers and the demonic world is an extremely real world that Christians are being taken out of. And so to me, that sort of hits home. And again, if you go into other worlds, in fact, I think it's still around here, but if you go into other parts of the world, mm-hmm. and people are coming out of magic and paganism to Christ, they're doing it not because they thought that all the stuff they were doing was phony. They found out that there was something more powerful that could deliver them from it. Mm-hmm. And we've been sort of, for the most part, cushioned from it, I think, in the Western world, maybe to our peril, but again, here we are, we have this whole world out there absolutely obsessed with paranormal stuff. Think about it. What's the bestseller, English-speaking world 1900? Maybe something like Peter Pan, okay, which is already beginning to look at the magical world because it's fairyland and all that other stuff. Okay, fine. So what's the most popular thing around 2000? It's obviously Harry Potter. So why is Harry Potter so powerful? My guess, it's not simply because J.K. Rowling is a brilliant writer. I give her credit for that. It's also feeding a need that people have to look at something beyond themselves, which is not necessarily putting big demands upon them. And that's why, of course, we're obsessed with superheroes. We're obsessed with something like E.T., because we can study them, look at them. I wouldn't say worship them, but honor them without them demanding anything in return other than our money to watch them. But you know what I'm saying. But the God of Israel saying, I've got all these. I have all these riches for you. All you have to do is acknowledge me and honor me, and acknowledge acknowledge about your own estate, and just do that. And we have a hard time doing that much, And so, in other words, I want you to understand there's something beyond you. I want you to understand that there's a spiritual world, and that etc. But you've got to do it on my terms and not on your terms. And of course, what do we want? We want to do it on our terms. So we're going to look for Bigfoot. We're going to look for all these things. We're going to look for the Anunnaki out in space and space creatures and all this other stuff, which to me, it's a symptom of our psyche in the modern West, is that we are created to look beyond ourselves. For about 1,500 years, we were satisfied with the Judeo-Christian answer, but once we began to become a post-Christian world, and we certainly are maybe in a conceptual, intellectual way, we're beginning that that didn't stop us from wanting to look for that outside realm. And so we're finding it in things, in fantasy, and then dark fantasy. I mean, all, scary movies, etc. All that other stuff is like, oh, I'm old enough to look at it and say, wow, that just doesn't fit my mental economy. But for younger generations, that's kind of like part of that even if it's considered vile, it's like, yeah, that's just part of our culture. It's just there. We're looking beyond ourselves, and we're trying to do it without God's demands.
Yeah, but we see that in the younger generation, this drive towards the supernatural, and in case evangelicals aren't aware, we're seeing that. We're seeing the people of the younger generation who are into all kinds of tarot, weird new age stuff, but we're seeing lots and lots, at least that's what reports are saying, of people coming out of New Age, like what you're saying, of they're not saying the stuff's not real, but they're meeting and encountering Jesus and saying, oh, that's the truth. But they're coming out of this New Age stuff, occult practices.
Yeah.
That stuff's all happening. They would, even some of these people that have been radically saved out of it, would attest, like, there's an obvious supernatural world around us, but you have to find the light, and you have to find Jesus, because he's the true and the only truth. He's the one who's in control of all of it.
Amen.
So, no, that's good. And so, kind of continuing off that, everything we've looked at from in the Old Testament, what's the terminology or the words that are used there when for demon? Because I know that demon in the New Testament is the Greek word. Are they all just different words, or is it a pretty?
There's no word. That's the problem. That's the whole point, is that we do not have. That's why when John Ralton writes his taxonomy, he's collecting all these words and he's lumping them together and saying, yeah, this is what we would later call demon. But there's no word. That's the whole point, is you have the lying spirit, you have the evil spirit, you've got the Rephaim, you've got the snare of the trapper. In other words, you've got the hyena creature or whatever. You've got all these things. And so what we do logically is we try to make sense of all of it and attach form to it. And by the way, that's the same thing that happened in the intertestamental period. And so they attached form to it, and then they attach form to the Genesis 6 story and say, these are the sons of God and daughters of men. And then they give you an extended, maybe you can call it midrash. It's a commentary on it, which is well known by the New Testament writers, and so they even quote it. It doesn't make it authoritative. I say that till I'm blue in my face, but it informs me about their own mental economy at that point. So no, to me, it looks, if you're trying to figure out a theology of demons, it's total chaos. It's just all these terms all over the place, and I have to try to pull them all together out of their context to create a context for them. And this is why every scholar who does it has a completely different form for them. It's because it's not the purpose of the writers to give you this information. They're assuming you know all about this stuff.
Yeah, so then what would you say to people who are, and maybe they're not dogmatic, but people either say, well, this would come down to the question of what are demons? They say it's either just fallen angels. Heiser is more of they are just the dead spirit, and maybe he doesn't say only, but
no, he doesn't.
The dead spirits of the Rephaim, or some other kind of entity. What's your answer to that question?
My answer is all of the above, although the fallen angels, I mean, again, demons, first of all, these are heavenly beings, and when we think of demons, we think of heavenly beings they're no longer on God's side. I suppose you look at it that way. But I don't know whether you can really categorize them any closer. And so that's why a book like Micaiah's is really a good starting point to look at them, because he shows you, basically he lays out all the information and purposely does not come to an easy conclusion. Like, all right, now we know that demons are just this, type and not this type. No, he lays out and shows you there's a lot of different types, but we're not privy to how all these types come together. I mean, we're not even sure how Satan. I mean, does Satan have control over all these different heavenly beings? I don't know. Maybe he does. I think it's implied in the New Testament that he does, but how does that work? We don't know. But it's not. But I think that what has happened in the Christian tradition is that, it's easy. You just sort of categorize them this way. You got Satan, and then you got all the fallen angels / demons, and they're all his minions. It's the good God over here doing all this, and this is the bad. And I won't call him God because you don't want to, but he's the counterpart, and he's got his host over here, and they're all doing his bidding. And maybe, but it's not easy to categorize them, and that's why when John Walton tries to categorize them in his short article, he's well aware that they sort of defy easy categorization.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. Yeah, and I've heard it with the serpent who now attributed Satan. I've heard the argument that it's, yes, in control of these other supernatural beings, but because this rebel of God is the one that brought upon death. So it's kind of like, like a criminal, a big crime ball. Well, that's the criminal that did that. It's kind of like he kind of becomes the top dog because he brought about this big downfall.
And really, if you think about it, I mean, I don't know how you logically conclude this, but if God demands complete loyalty, if I'm by nature a rebellious creature, why would you expect me to be loyal to the disloyal being? In other words, I would probably act the same way. If I'm rebellious, I'm in perpetual rebellion. So that's why I would think that hell would be perpetually chaotic.
Right. Yeah. Like, now they're going to be completely obedient to the rebel.
Right.
That that goes against.
Now, I don't know. I'm sure theologians have discussed this, and I hadn't really thought about it. So
it's an interesting concept.
Yes. Don't harm me too much.
We're just surmising and pondering.
Yes. Yeah.
So then, and this might be maybe I'll have one more after this. But you talked about it with Samuel, but with some other ones. And I think you see it in Ezekiel 32, where it's giving credence to the Rephaim spirits.
Yeah.
So are they are in the are they coming and going, or where do they rest? Do they come up and then they get sent back? If they do get sent back to the underworld, are they locked up forever? Is that like their domain where they live?
Yeah,
that's
a good question.
And to people who don't even know what I'm asking, I apologize. But I can't think of them off the top of my head, but those specific verses where it seems like, well, then they came to do this. It's like, so they came from the abyss or the underworld. Like, is that their domain? And then in other places, it seems like God sends them there, but locks them away. So then, are there ones that aren't locked away, so then they can come back?
Well, that's why in Enoch, of course, the Satan character Mastema is saying to God, I can't do my evil work if you don't give me any demons. Please give me 1/10 of them. Which, of course, it's like, all right, that's sort of interesting. And why would even God want to bargain with him? Because, of course, think about it. The Satan creature has not had his judgment yet. That's the whole point. He's not. So he's not been chained. Although now he's already seen that the deed of the earth has been. He's lost the deed. He's lost the deed. To death. It just hasn't. The final consummation hasn't happened yet, and so he can still dialogue. I don't know how that works. Sounds pretty scary to me. I'm kind of glad that I don't know. So where are the creatures right now? What are they doing? Again, the intertestamental period. We'll talk a lot about it in Mesopotamia. Some creatures like the lesser creatures can come from the netherworld up into here and down. At the behest of other gods, but the netherworld gods, by the way, I can't. For example, netherworld gods do not get offerings. Ereshkigal, the queen of the netherworld, she doesn't have her own temple because she's down there, and I don't want to go down there until I have to. Once I go down there, then I'm subservient to her and her minions. And so that's the conceptual world that the Old Testament is in. And so
some are probably chained up, and then others.
Yes. And of course, like I said, since that's not made explicit in the Old Testament, that's why we have the intertestamental text trying to explain things that were not explained fully enough in their mind.
Revelation alludes to it as well.
Yes, it does. And so, and you can't read Revelation without reading. Really, if you think about it, you have to know not only your Old Testament, you have to know all of your intertestamental literature in order for Revelation to really make full sense. And that's hard and a lot of work, but fulfilling, because all that weird imagery is alluding to things that the reader/listener in the end of the first century AD is aware of.
Mm.
But it's not our environment any longer. Have I ever said that before? I think I have.
Just a few times.
Yeah.
So the last question would just be, any differentiation, not maybe different in substance, different on how they are viewed, Old Testament to New Testament demons, and then off of that, in light of what we've looked at, when we see Jesus come on the scene and do that, and then resurrect and defeat death, and also claim, have dominion over everything, but clearly also, while he's doing his ministry on earth, claim dominion and power over demons. Just talk about all that. You know what I mean? Because in light of that Old Testament and what they're afraid of and everything, and the way that Jesus does things, that message and that power, like, it's more than just, well, Jesus casts out demons because that's what Jesus does. Like, just the depth, richness, and beauty and the glory of God in that is pretty astounding.
Maybe the principle is the same for all these things, but it's kind of like, does the Old Testament talk about afterlife and death? Yes. Does it do it in a way that is satisfactory for somebody asking lots of questions? No. And so you have the New Testament with the benefit of all of that intertestamental literature. And so what about demons and other things? Maybe it's the difference between black and white TV from 1960 and HD TV. In other words, you've got this thing here and you can understand things, but there is a development over time in their theology. And so does Satan and evil, evil exists in the Old Testament? Yes. Would you have ever figured out Satan in his full form without the New Testament? No, of course not. Do we understand demonic activity from the Old Testament? Yes. Do we get a lot more information as to how all of this works in the intertestamental and New Testament period? Yes. And so demons, so there's a catch-all name for all of them in the New Testament. It's called demons. And sometimes demons are called unclean spirits. Like I said from the very beginning, are they the same term? No, not exactly, because demon is a more generic word. Unclean spirit seems to be more specifically directed to those creatures which are the hybrid, the products of the Genesis 6 tradition. Does that mean that there are other demons that aren't? I don't know, I guess. But I'll leave you to read someone like Micaiah, who really spent a lot of work. And again, if you want to read his book, the first thing you might do is look at his bibliography and pore over his bibliography if you really want to do a serious in-depth study. Then start reading his work to see what is he using to deal with this. It's actually, it could be a lifetime of work. I mean, it would take you really years of work simply to look at the sources that he uses, and it also shows you how much work he did to get there. He didn't write it in a week.
Well, there you go. Well, that was our series on demons. We thank you for sticking around. We hope that you enjoyed this. With anything that we do, we just our hope and prayer is that it kind of opens your mind more to all the depth and beauty that is in the Bible. We want you guys to fall in love with reading and understanding your Bible more, and ultimately Jesus. And so we appreciate you guys. Also, if you have ideas or things or topics you really want to hear discussed, please, even on just this episode, any episode you're listening to, please drop them in the comments. We want to bring you material that you guys are specifically interested in. So yeah, feel free.
But only ones that I can do. But
so bring on all the theological topics so that I'm happy, and then Mark can be scared about
nervous.
it. Yeah, he'll be nervous about it. So feel free. Drop us what you want us to cover in the future. Otherwise, we hope that you have found this series helpful. And as always, like, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. And we'll see you guys next time on the Buried Bible Podcast.
So long.